Thank you very much, Michelle. You've made a number of comments. Homelessness can happen to anyone, and I think it's so easy to push aside, oh, that's always somebody else. The issue of the cloud of stigmatisation, well, it's their fault, isn't it, that they're homeless? And you've reminded us that that's not the way we should approach this. You also raised the fact that, as we've heard from the Lord Mayor and from Rosemary, we need to understand the fullness of the problem, and you focused on particular issues that so often do get underrated in terms of the seriousness of the problem, domestic violence, for example. We need to address underlying causes in the very first place, and I like particularly your comment that the essential construct is equal citizenship. And clearly, unless we have that perspective, then we're not really going to fairly deal with the problem. You made some comments about state and federal governments, and as a former politician, former leader of a government, I have to say the record of the Playford and Dunstan governments in particular in extending social housing in our community was commendable, world class. I also have to say that over the last 25 years, under governments of both persuasions, state and federal, the commitment to social housing has not been as strong as it was in those earlier times. Now, we can argue all sorts of reasons why that's so, but that's not the point. The result has been people who end up homeless because we could not support them properly. And so I'm very pleased, Michelle, that you've accepted the invitation and that Zoe has accepted the invitation this afternoon, because I hope that means a commitment across the political divide that these issues do need to be addressed. They do need to be picked up by whoever is in government, whenever they are in government. And to have noted that the last 25 years, which includes the tail end of my own government, has seen a decline in the public housing stock is something that I think we should hold our heads in shame about. So we have the opportunities at conferences such as this to bring together those involved, to interact across the political divide, to encourage responses that will lead to them playing their part with the community sector in addressing homelessness in our community. So thank you very much, Michelle. Please thank Michelle Lansing. David Pearson is our next speaker, and he's the Executive Director of the Don Dunstan Foundation. You'll know in your brochure, you'll see in your brochure a description of the Don Dunstan Foundation if you hadn't known what it was. But what I particularly like is the way it's being put now. The Foundation is a thought leadership organisation that works on collaborative projects to inspire action for a fairer world and to build on the legacy of Don Dunstan. And I think this idea of being thought leadership to actually help change the narratives of community. In the end, we are the narrative, all of us as South Australians, but we need those of us who have the chance to take the narrative, grasp it, and try and lead it in directions it ought to go. And so the Don Dunstan Foundation feels privileged to be able to have this role. And David Pearson, as Executive Director, is providing some stunning leadership to the team in helping us do that. Would you please welcome David Pearson?
Hello everyone. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Rosemary, thank you so much for that very thoughtful welcome to country. Can I acknowledge all the other VIPs that are in the room today and everyone for being here? I really appreciate it. Was a bit nervous last week whether or not you'd all rock up, but we have sold out, and if you want, there's some tables out here at the front if there's anyone at the back of the room who would like to sit down. But thank you very much to the Mayor for your powerful words and your call to action, really. To the Minister for that reminder. I think that at this point last year we were uncertain about the funding that this sector had. There was a huge cloud, and that cloud has been removed. That is so incredibly powerful and important, and an important reminder that what we're talking about here today, we would be having a very different conversation had we not had that funding certainty that so many of the organisations in this room rely upon. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Functional Zero approach today, to tell two stories that I've had over the past 12 months since starting at the Foundation, and to provide an update on the Adelaide Zero Project. So 12 months ago today, Roseanne Haggerty stood here on this stage, in this venue, and issued a challenge to South Australia. She said that we needed to stop thinking about homelessness as something that needed to be addressed, and we needed to instead think of it as something that we should seek to end. She outlined how the functional zero approach in the US was doing just that. Functional zero, she said, is reached when the average capacity of a housing system is greater than the existing need, and it can be proven with real-time data. In seeking to understand this approach better, I looked up what functional zero means, and the dictionary told me that to be functional is to be designed to be practical, to be useful, rather than attractive. You'll find more in our discussion paper on the Zero Project, the details on what the technical definition of what functional zero means. But to me, I think that summarises it quite well. To be practical, to be hands-on, to be well-designed, and to be real-world. As Roseanne said last year, the functional zero is a sustainable zero. It gives us a way of starting to think about homelessness in a way that the international community started to think about polio in the 1980s. Since that time, the global community has come together to try and end polio, and as a result, we've seen reported cases reduced by 99.9%. It's something that the international community should be incredibly proud of. And today, there are more than 16 million people who have been saved from paralysis because of these global efforts, from organisations, individuals, philanthropists, governments, and many others. We should think of homelessness like polio and put in place a bold and sustainable plan to eliminate it from our streets. Roseanne set that challenge out for us just over a year ago, and I'm pleased to say that our community's response has been the Adelaide Zero Project. It is the beginning of a bold and I hope ultimately sustainable plan to end street homelessness in the Adelaide City. And just like polio, a broad range of organisations and individuals from the private, public and community sectors have come together and are supporting it. I'd particularly like to pay tribute today for one of the private sector organisations that have really taken up that challenge with Bendigo Bank. It's a bold thing for an organisation like them to say, we're going to support a process that isn't traditionally about service delivery on the front line. It's a process that actually will involve a lot of talking, and it's a bit of a risk for an organisation like that. So I'd like to pay particular tribute to them today. But we should think of homelessness like polio. And however, unlike polio, homelessness is a complicated issue. It can't be cured with a vaccine. It involves dealing with complicated people, with complicated lives, and with not one complicated system, but many. I'll return to the issue of systems and complexity shortly, but I'd like to tell you the first of the two stories of my journey on working on this project in the last 12 months. So earlier this year, I had the privilege of attending with my colleagues Ingold and Smith and Peter Sandeman to the Institute of Global Homelessness Conference in Chicago. There we heard about the efforts of cities around the world grappling with the issue of street homelessness. We learned from representatives from very different countries about their efforts of dealing with rough sleepers and people on the streets of their cities. Now, the numbers I'm about to share with you don't exactly compare like with like, but they give you a sense of scale. In Chicago, they reported 1,200 people sleeping rough on their streets. In Pretoria, 6,200. San Juan, 4,500. In Tokyo, 1,700 rough sleepers in their city. And in cities with a similar population size to Adelaide, which has a population of 1.1 million, Edmonton had 890 rough sleepers, with a population of 930,000 people. Brussels had 500 rough sleepers with a population of 1.3. Montevideo had 550 with a population of 1.3. And Baltimore, half our population size, had 330 rough sleepers. And in Adelaide, with a population of 1.1 million, we have 120 people sleeping rough, on average, on any given night, at the moment in our city. Adelaide is uniquely placed to deal with this challenge. We are presented with what, by global standards, is a very small number of people that sleep rough in our downtown area. And so when I presented the number of how many people are sleeping rough in our city, one of the people asked me at this conference, well, how much funding do you receive to support that? And I read out what my briefing pack told me, that we receive in South Australia $60 million per year from various sources that support statewide homelessness service. And that, as a community, we fund 39 government and non-government organisations providing 80 programs through 97 service outlets across the state. Within the inner city, we support 17 government and non-government specialist homeless service providers, and we support those who are experiencing rough sleeping. I read this out, and my colleague from South Africa said to me, with 120 rough sleepers, why don't you just buy them all a house? Everyone did what you did, and they laughed. And I said, well, yes, we could do that, but what would we do the next day? And for the rest of the conference, he and a few others from around the world started referring to me as that guy from the South Australian homeless industrial complex. Now, I think these comparisons aren't fair, and this funding and these services help more than just rough sleepers. But why I tell this story and what the experience highlighted for me is that two things. First, we can and we should do more to focus the efforts of this system, our homelessness services system, and all the resources that it has to better support the most visible form of homelessness and often the most vulnerable form of homelessness, those sleeping on our streets. And second, the experience highlighted for me that we can absolutely work better together to address what is, by global standards, a small number of people sleeping rough. And so I want to focus on these two things for a moment, fixing the system and working better together. Roseanne said last year, if the system isn't working, then no amount of individual effort is going to fix the problem. It will only be collective action that does that. That no amount of new money, as needed as it might be, is really going to address the issue. And what the stats that I read out in Chicago, the amount of funding, the amount of peer services that we provide, is not that we have a system that has too much money, as my South African colleague has suggested, but that a system with this many resources, it ought to be able to get a better outcome for the 120 people sleeping rough on our streets every single night. Now, bear in mind that I read these stats out just after we'd had a presentation about how a range of communities in the United States have been successful in achieving functional zero homelessness. And you'll see on your screens now some of the stories that are showing what that success looked like. And Jake's going to tell us a little bit more about that later in the conference. But what I learned from these US communities is that they made a pragmatic and strategic decision to focus on the form of homelessness that most united their communities to take action. In the US, for obvious reasons, their focus was on veterans. They did this not because veterans are the most deserving and the most suffering group of homeless. They did it because they wanted to demonstrate success. And success they have demonstrated. 7 communities have achieved functional zero homelessness for veterans, and 2 of them have gone on to achieve it for functional zero for chronically homeless people as well. This strategy, I think, is one we should follow. And what they understood is that money going into a system that isn't working for the most needed in that community is not money that communities will ultimately be willing to continue to invest in. I believe that our homeless service system and our housing system does need more resources, but we should be able to show that more resources will lead to better outcomes. And that's what's so exciting about the Aspire social impact bond. I believe that it will show what we all know, that sustained investment over a long period of time will save taxpayers' money and help homeless people. And if you're interested in learning more about the Aspire bond and the program, I encourage you to attend one of the mini presentations that we'll have later on this afternoon. It's also what's exciting about the work that's being done on the inner city and the reform that's been led there. There is great work happening in our system, and there'll be more information about that in the mini presentations. But on their own, the Street Crew, the Aspire Bond, these programs won't be enough to end homelessness in Adelaide on their own. We have to look at the system, and we have to treat the problem like polio. We need a bold, sustainable plan that will help us change the way the system works. And that's where the Zero Project comes in. It's not a program, it's a collective effort to change the system. And to change it with one outcome in mind, to measure it, to report it, and once it's achieved, to sustain it. Then our goal should be to expand the functional zero approach to outside the city, as Lynn was talking about earlier, to other forms of homelessness, broader than just rough sleepers. But it starts with a bold declaration, and that this just isn't good enough anymore. That, as the Mayor stated, we live in one of the most livable cities in the world, and it just isn't good enough that so many of our fellow citizens have nowhere to live in the world's most livable city. We have already declared to the world that we want Adelaide to be a carbon neutral city, and that we did this with no idea of how we would achieve it, what it might cost, but we did it because we thought it was the right thing to do. And it was a good thing to do, and now we have a plan to achieve it. And it's a great example of our city council and our state government working together with those in our community to boldly declare our city's ambitions to reduce our impact on the climate to zero. Since that time, we've attracted the world's largest lithium-ion battery, and just this week, a new solar thermal plant in Port Augusta to help those ambitions. I can't stand here and tell you how we can achieve the functional zero approach in Adelaide, nor when we can achieve it by, or how much it might cost. All I can say is that as a nation as wealthy as ours, as a city as compassionate as ours, with a system that has the resources at its disposal as ours, that we ought to be able to get a better outcome for those 120 people sleeping rough and move that and then continue to improve those outcomes for others. By simply trying, we have the opportunity to be the first city outside of North America to commit to achieving functional zero homelessness. Others around Australia are leading the way in other elements of this project, but I think we have an opportunity to bring all the elements together and do it in a timely way. We know that we also, and who knows, in doing that, we might just attract the next Elon Musk, as the Carbon Neutral Project has done. Or we might just attract the next Bill Gates, as the polio efforts did. But what the Zero Project does is state boldly that we will no longer tolerate our fellow citizens sleeping rough, and that we want to change the system and that we'll work better together to do it. So that's what the Zero Project will do. Modelled on the US, it will help build a movement of people, organisations and others willing to put their shoulder to the wheel. And we need to do this right now, because I firmly believe we're at a fork in the road. And the two ways we could go have been on your screen. We could go the way of Sydney and Melbourne, where homelessness has been criminalised and politicised, and the buck has been passed between different levels of government and different agencies, or we can go the way of the United States. We are at risk here if we don't choose the right path. So I'd like to move on to my second story. This is the second story of my experiences over the last 12 months. And so earlier this week, I went and spoke to a few traders in our city's East End. And I'd had, obviously, the opportunity earlier in the year to talk to people from a global perspective about what's going on homelessness. And I've obviously had a chance to work with the service providers over the better part of the last year to work with them about the issues we face. But I wanted to get the perspective of the traders because I hadn't heard them. I have heard the perspectives of homeless people themselves, and I've had a chance to do that. I've had a chance to have the perspective of service providers and of government agencies, but the traders was a group of people who are on the front line every day working and dealing with homeless people. They are retailers, they are building owners, they are property managers. And I had a coffee with this one guy who showed me the photos he's been taking of the rubbish, the bedding, the needles, the human excrement that him and the other traders had been cleaning up on a daily basis. The guy I met with was not unsympathetic to the plight of homeless people. He told me of a close friend of his who he'd lost to the bottle and then to the streets and ultimately to illness. His compassion was strong, but it had run out. He wanted something done, he wanted it done now, he wanted them moved on and if necessarily locked up. This was a decent guy who had what I would call compassion fatigue. And we've seen where this leads. And the images on the screen reinforce that for you. The unemployed are often referred to as dole bludgers and leaners and not lifters. And that's where the public debate goes when these kinds of issues are left unaddressed. That's where the public dialogue and public policy matter discussions happen when we don't address all parts of the problem. So how long until this dialogue becomes the way some in our community start referring to the homelessness in Adelaide? We've had a taste of what's to come with the South Terrace Parklands issues, but there is another way, and we need to keep the politics out of this. We need to make sure that the people are at the forefront of what we're doing, and the people who are homeless, the people who are dealing with the homeless, and the system in which all of those people are working. We need to listen to the concerns of those in our city who are on the front line, and I can hear you say, and if you're interested in hearing more about all of these perspectives, there are many presentations that touch on all of those areas as part of the conference today. We need to learn the lessons from those who have successfully implemented the functional zero approach in the US. And we are so privileged to have Jake Maguire from Community Solutions here today to tell us more about the work that he has done on the Built for Zero campaign. And of course, we need to be informed by evidence and best practice. And we are again fortunate to have experts from our 3 states universities and Cameron Parcell as one of our keynotes. So in wrapping up, can I say a few final words about the next steps from here on the Zero Project? First, I'd like to acknowledge my appreciation for the support of all the leaders who have been involved, particularly the Lord Mayor for his endless support, to the Minister for her continuing efforts and encouragement, to the Shadow Minister for being here today and offering her words of support, and to the others who I've been talking to. I'd like to particularly thank Louise Miller-Frost, the CEO of Catherine House, and Peter Sanderman, the CEO of Anglicare, who have agreed to co-chair the project steering group that will guide the next steps of the project. I'd particularly like to take a special thanks to Carol Shard from Housing SA, who has just been so supportive and helpful at every step along the way and engaged in such a collaborative way in which this project's come together. But today we're launching a discussion paper that sets out the Zero Project and what we're seeking to achieve, how it will work and act as a mechanism The discussion paper will act as a mechanism to gain feedback from all parts of our community, to hear all voices about what the approach we should take. I encourage you to read it and to provide feedback to the researchers who have done such an excellent job in such a short period of time writing it. One of the streams later today is focused on exploring this project in more detail, and I encourage you to attend if you're interested. The discussion paper sets out how the Adelaide Zero Project has been broken up into a number of phases as well. The first phase is the establishment phase. The second will seek to implement the functional zero approach in the Adelaide City Council area. The third phase will begin once we've achieved functional zero and would seek to sustain it. Finally, the fourth phase would then seek to expand the approach to new areas. The release today of the discussion paper marks the beginning of phase one, establishment. And once we've received this feedback, the research was put together an issues paper that will set out in detail the key components of how this project will work, how they could be implemented, who could help us to do this, and what other support needs to be done. We are seeking to be informed by what's often called a collective impact approach, which means that it's not the Dunstan Foundation that's going to do every part of this project. It's all of you in this room and others outside, and that we will take a role in coordinating and making sure that everything gets done. Then, once that issues paper is set out, a 90-day change project will act as a mechanism for deliberating on these matters. And it will be the process through which issues like measurement, timelines, ultimate government structures and targets are agreed. We have chosen this process because it cannot sort these things out in 90 days, then we probably never will. And so at the conclusion of the 90-day project, we'll have a draft final report that will set out what we have decided, and we hope to have this report by early next year. And to use the carbon neutral analogy again, that would be the point at which we could say, by when can we achieve the carbon neutral goal, or in this case, functional zero? And so that we can, and when we've got that report, we will have a community plan, a bold and I hope sustainable plan that will not just address homelessness in our city, but functionally end it. These are, of course, many more elements, and these are set out in the discussion paper, and I encourage you to provide that feedback. But in wrapping up, can I offer my heartfelt thanks to the sponsors of today's conference, all of those sponsors, and to the partners in the Zero Project, without whose support we simply wouldn't be here today. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here and for being part of this conference and for the work that you do each and every day. You can find copies of the discussion paper in the foyer shortly, which will be out when we have morning tea. But finally, can I say that this conference has been organised by the Don Dunstan Foundation, and as Lynn mentioned before, we exist to inspire action for a fairer world, and I hope that this conference inspires you to take action for a fairer world for our homeless citizens. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. I particularly liked the way in which you came at the issue by using the example of polio. You know, one may think that if somebody has polio, you cure them. But in fact, the real issue is to stop it happening. You identified 125 rough sleepers in Adelaide. If you simply cure the problem, you do something for 125 people, perhaps, but you don't stop the problem. And so there is such a thing as social epidemiology, where you can actually translate the concepts involved in something like stopping polio with something like stopping a social epidemic. And homelessness is such a social epidemic. And it's a social epidemic that not only will lead to more people being affected by it, it can also lead to its own negative reactions. And you address the issue of compassion fatigue, which you said was where the debate goes where we don't address the issues. And if people feel the problems are too difficult, too complex, then that's what could be the outcome. There's two truisms about complex problems, by the way. You've probably heard it. Two truisms are this. For every complex problem, there is a simple solution. That's true, by the way. Every complex problem has a simple solution. Truism number one. Truism number two, the simple solution is always wrong. Now, what does one do in a situation like that? Give up? If that's the case, it's not even worth our while being here. But if ever there was a reason to be here, it's because of that. Because it doesn't say it can't be solved, it just says it can't be solved simplistically. And so the issue is to find out how, in a complex way, it can be solved. And complex means a complex of ideas, of engagement, of people, of stakeholders, and you are that complex. I'm not giving you a complex, you are the complex. And so the Functional Zero Project is an attempt to bring all those things together. And David, your studying of what functional zero means, sustainable zero, is precisely the point. Cure something for some people now, but stop it for others at risk in the future. So would you please join me in thanking David Pearson. Now, you're about to get your caffeine hit, courtesy of Uniting Care Wesley Bowden. But before you do, can I just say that what's going to happen after the morning tea break is there will be another couple of speakers. You'll see them listed in your program. And then from 11:10, you will be breaking into groups. And you have the opportunity to choose 3 in the space of an hour, 20 minutes each. There are 17 on the buffet of choices. And that's going to be difficult to choose 3 out of the 17 because they all look very powerful and fascinating. And obviously, if you're here with others from your own organisation, you'll break up so that different people can get exposure to different ideas. Each presentation, as I say, will go for about 20 minutes. Then a song will play at the end of each 20-minute presentation. I've been promised by David that this will not be karaoke singing by the Don Dunstan Foundation team. It will be something recorded. And that will tell you when to move on to the next session. So over the break, when you're enjoying the coffee, decide which of the 17 you're going to choose 3 from to be part of that session from 10 past 11 after there's been a couple more keynote presentations. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you to our presenters this morning, to the Lord Mayor, to Michelle Lensink, to David, to Rosemary Wanganeen, and thank you all once again. Please go and enjoy now, courtesy of Uniting Care Wesley Bowden, coffee, tea and refreshments. Thank you very much.